Hi everyone, this week we've got Tim on the show from Credas and we're going to be talking about overseas buyers, sanction checks and compliance. As usual, Tim, before we do anything, quick introduction from you, please.
Yeah, my name's Tim Barnett. I'm the CEO here at Credas Technologies. Credas is part of a larger group called the Indigo Group, based in Cardiff in South Wales. And what we do is we provide compliance services, and we specialise in the estate agency and conveyancing market. So over 90% of our business is estate agents and conveyancing doing AML and IDV checks.
Wicked. So Tim, my first question for you. You've seen a significant drop in overseas buyers in the past 12 months. Why is that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Lee, right? So first of all, we have to be careful with data, isn't it? Because we can pony it up in different ways in different cases. So to establish like a baseline, first of all, and a credibility in the data. So we know roughly, if we talk about estate agents for a second, right, roughly half the market uses digital processes to do their AML and ID checks. The other half are still tend to be using manual processes, you know, coming into a branch and photocopying it and stuff like that, yeah. Of the half that are using digital processes, about 40%, between 41% of those will be processed through Credas in the UK, yeah, either directly through us or through one of our resellers or partners, or also through any of the people that we license our technology to under white label agreements. So it's a significant part, and we've got a big window, if that makes sense, into that part of the market. So that establishes the baseline. In terms of what we've seen, particularly for AML checks and ID checks relating to property transactions over the last few years, is that as a proportion, those from overseas territories and non-UK residents has been decreasing over the last, since 2018, by a significant amount, actually. So over half the checks were in 2018 were for overseas buyers, and that's now down to about a third, right? So what a lot of people assume is a lot less overseas buyers coming into the market, and that may or may not be the case. I don't think that's what the story is, though, Lee, for this data, right? If you look at the same period, right, less than 1% of the housing stock in the UK is actually owned by non-UK residents, and yet over half or a third of all the AML checks being carried out is on overseas residents. So a very tiny part of the ownership. So I think the real story on this is, as a proportion, for sure, right, they're getting less, but it's still massively overrepresented, right? So as a proportion, overseas buyers going through AML checks getting less and less can be doing for two reasons. Either because there's less than coming in, you know, might be the case, but probably much more significant as we're doing more checks on UK residents. So does that make sense? That's automatically pushing down the overseas one. And I think probably the story for me in this stat is not necessarily whether there's more or less foreign people coming in and buying houses, probably the shocking amount of UK buyers who aren't being checked in any way. Does that make sense? It shouldn't be that if less than 1% of the stock is owned by overseas people, and yet half to a third of all AML checks are on this one group of people. So we come back, which is quite a real surprise in stock. It indicates that UK residents are just not being checked in the volumes that they should be. So, and we can back this up anecdotally. So every month, our team are doing hundreds and hundreds of demos. Right? We speak to thousands of estate agents right across the UK, and the level of awareness is still, I mean, better than it was 2-3 years ago, where pretty much all of our job was educating people that this legislation does matter to estate agents and conveyancers. But there's still a huge amount of that still to do, and we get it all the time where people say, "No, it's okay. I just check their driving license. That's all they have to do if they're a UK resident." Right? Even big players, you know, big brands that we'd all have heard of, are unaware that they're completely non-compliant. So I think that's the story of these stats, really. It's not necessarily whether there's less buyers coming in, it's the sheer quantity of UK residents who aren't being subjected to checks at all.
Yeah, I think I wanted to ask you on that about sort of the third of estate agents that, you know, they're not compliant in your sort of survey done. So is that, I think that is a huge amount of the number that's come out. What was your sort of survey? How many did you do and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's just interesting, right? So we ran a survey, and there's some really good stuff in there as well, right? So nearly 90%, I think it's 88% of estate agents who were surveyed said that they were aware that it was their responsibility to run these checks, right? Which is good, you know, that level of acceptance. And I speak to a lot of estate agents in my job, And quite often, the feedback I'll get is, bloody hell, all we hear about is compliance and AML, and why is it us? Why are we doing this and nobody else? And there's a really good reason for that, right? Is if you add up every single sector in the UK economy, right, and the amount of dirty money that's laundered through them, it doesn't get close to the amount of money that goes through the property transaction sector in the UK. Which is largely estate agents, right? So the problem for the UK, absolutely, it dwarfs all of the sectors together. So the reason why it's a problem for estate agents and why it's been put on them by the government and HMRC is because, frankly, that's where the problem is for our country. Do you know what I mean? The vast majority of dirty money coming in is being washed through property transactions. So that's the why, first of all. And clearly there's an acceptance that, okay, 9 out of 10 estate agents understand that it is their responsibility. But really surprising, 1 in 3 self-diagnose themselves as being non-compliant. And actually the number of non-compliant will be a lot higher than that. And again, we see it through our audits all the time, where a lot of estate agencies believe they're compliant, but actually aren't. Their processes aren't, might be something they put in place 4 years ago, right? And they're just not robust or don't pass the stress test at all. So yeah, it's a really interesting space. It's an estate agent problem because, frankly, that's where the problem is for the country, and that's where HMRC have done a good job of going, it is your problem, and we'll fine you for it if you're non-compliant. And there's an acknowledgement, actually, amongst people that we speak to, that some of their processes aren't up to scratch and aren't compliant. Very interesting, the proportion of fines that get doled out to UK companies. If you take every other sector, banking, financial services, gambling, right, every other sector in the economy, add it together, and again, it's dwarfed by estate agents, by the number of people who are getting fined or even having their AML registrations removed by HMRC. So really, I mean, it is our sectors where the problem is, really. And part of our job is to help provide tools and solutions that are quite cheap and basically allow people to become compliant and hopefully make the entire process a bit more efficient and remove barriers to sale as well. But yeah, it's a really interesting time. There is an acknowledgement that it is a problem. And I think a lot of estate agents do realise that their own systems aren't up to scratch. The problem many have, though, the feedback we get is we just don't have the time. Yeah. Well, it's surprising you get 50 grand fine and then suddenly, most people find the time pretty quickly after that. So,
I can bet.
Prevention is better than curing it afterwards, isn't it?
It is. Just want to ask you a quick question, Tim, on sanction checks. Has this increased since the war on Russia began?
Yeah, it's that's actually had a very big impact, right? So since Russia invaded the Ukraine, yep, and Western governments and organisations started sanctioning individuals within that country, a lot of companies, because it was big, it still is big news, turn the telly on, it's there every day. And so a lot of companies use that as a catalyst to start looking at their own processes. So PEPs and sanctions checks volumes are up 40% since the start of the war. And that's accounted for in 2 areas, really. Number one, people who were previously doing PEPs and sanctions now starting to do them and incorporating those into their compliance process, but also a huge amount of the customer base started rechecking their customers. It's a very, very interesting point in legislation, which is missed by many people. Legislation stipulates that PEPs and sanctions checks need to be rerun at regular intervals. Now, it doesn't sort of prescribe what regular means. That needs to be determined by the estate agent or conveyancer, and presumably that would be determined by their own risk assessment for that client, but they do need to recheck regularly, and very few do. We have a tool called ongoing monitoring. You can turn it on and it just automates rerunning in the checks, and we've got a new service coming out shortly where if there's a change, you'll be proactively notified. But very few people turn it on, so they're not redoing the checks. So when the war came, sanctions are in the news every day, and a lot of people did a batch recheck of their existing customer base and have now started turning on the tools to automate rerunning these checks every 2, 3, 4, 5 months, whatever they choose. And so overall volumes have increased. Very interesting, actually, right? The PEPs and sanctions lists are updated daily. I get notifications every time there's an update, and I've never seen it in my career, so many updates every single day, multiple lists adding people and data onto those lists. It's very, very important. Just because you might have run a PEPs and sanctions check on somebody 6 months ago or 12 months ago or 3 months ago doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't flag now. Particularly, obviously, in certain parts of the world. There's another interesting thing about PEPs and sanctions that people think quite often that they should only apply those to people from overseas or only to Russians. right? If you look at all the individuals who are on the various different lists, we checked 56 different lists. If you look at the individuals, 81 different countries are represented on there. So it's not just Russians. There's an unconscious bias sometimes. It's a worldwide problem. And even for UK residents, there's at least 11 UK residents on those lists as well. So PEPs and sanctions, whether you run them or not, should be determined by your risk assessment for that client. And legislation does say that they need to be run regularly and repeated regularly. So yeah, 40% up since the start of the war. So it has had a big impact.
Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate your time and coming on the show. And thank you for your insights.
No problem. Take care, Lee.